Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we're taking a look at two powerful new utility pedals from COOPERFX. So typically I record these videos in a fairly linear fashion. I'll start by writing the kind of song portion of the video, the thing that you just heard. I will then sit down and record this part where I kind of talk about the pedals that we're looking at today, and then I will kind of transition into and then subsequently set up and shoot the pedal board sound samples portion of the video. This video not only has taken a lot longer, I think this is day 4 of shooting for this review, but this is also the second full pass that I've done. I finished editing this part of the video, the speaking part of the video already, and we're back and we're reshooting it because I just finished day 2 of pedal board clips for this video, and I think I need to take a new swing at talking about these pedals. We're here talking about I should probably tell you what we're talking about. We're here talking about the COOPERFX expression generator and the signal path selector. And these are devices that seem on their surface pretty unassuming, but as you dig into it, especially with the inclusion of MIDI control on utility devices, you will realize that these things actually are some of the most intricate and complex pedals that you can add to your signal chain. And I mean that in the good ways and the bad ways. So let's talk about it. Let's start with the simpler pedal here. This is the signal path selector. At its core, it is a junction box that has 2 effects loops in it. You have send and return 1 and send and return 2. You have 2 loops. You can put any number of pedals in either of them. For the purposes of this video, I'm putting 1 pedal in each at any given time. And that is more because that's what I had room for on the board and kind of what I felt compelled to kind of look at for the purposes of demonstrating what this is capable of. But there's no limitations. You could put 2 complete independent signal chains in these, run them in parallel and run them into each other, or just pick and choose between the 2. But the layout at its core is simple. You have your in and your out. That is going to be your guitar input and your dry through. You have your send and return for loop 1, which has its volume and its bypass switch. Your second loop, its volume, its bypass switch. You have your dry control here if you don't want any dry guitar processing through this pedal. And then in the middle, you have these 3 buttons. You have A running series into B, B running series into A, or A and B in parallel, which is what we focus on a lot in this video. These kinds of pedals are incredibly useful for a lot of reasons. You can implement some really basic, incredibly useful stuff like running your delay and your reverb in parallel with one another. At its simplest, putting something like a delay and a reverb side by side in something like this thing is incredibly useful. Being able to run them in parallel allows you to have your delay repeats not get swallowed up by your reverb. And conversely, it allows the decay of your reverb to not get lengthened out by a particularly long delay trail. There's a lot of function in that. There's a lot of clarity that can be gained for your individual effects by running them in parallel. The ability to also route them in other ways without having to do physical cable repatching is incredibly useful. The reason this gets so interesting is not because you can do some basic easy patching, which you can, and it's incredibly useful, and that's why I'm using the term utility pedal when I talk about these. It's that you have MIDI control up here, and you have MIDI control over everything in this thing. You can use MIDI to phase invert volume A or volume B, which can let you do intentionally out of phase things or quickly solve for phase issues from your MIDI controller without having to bend down, press and hold, do anything else. You can also use MIDI CC values to control the volume or the feedback of your individual loops, including ramping that volume, which we will explore in depth towards the end of this video. That means you can do something like what I call the Andy Offling method, which is putting 2 different loopers in parallel with one another, often like the chase bliss mood and the chase bliss blooper, feeding them different little bits of signal that they can kind of loop and chew up on their own, and then automating volume swells on both of those things using this pedal. You're not having to like send multiple MIDI channels to multiple pedals to do multiple layers of ramping. You can send a single MIDI cable to this pedal, a single set of MIDI commands, and it will ramp the volume for those things. You can also just pull up presets of pre-configured organizational setups for this pedal. There's a lot to be unpacked in what should be and would normally be thought of as a very simple pedal. Really interesting stuff. And like I said, for all of that stuff, this is still the simpler pedal of the two, which brings us to our second pedal. This is the COOPERFX Expression Generator, the crazy genius love child of the COOPERFX team and Sacramento's very own Devon Whitaker. You know him as the blue-gloved genius here on YouTube, one of my favorite YouTube channels, one of my favorite content creators, and honestly, one of my favorite musicians I've ever collaborated with. He is a brilliant guy, and the fact that he kind of helped blue sky and white paper out this pedal is awesome, because this thing, it looks unassuming and it's so complicated. This is, as its name implies, an automated expression pedal. You have your start point, your stop point. This controls how low your heel is. This controls how high your toe is in the expression rate and kind of like sweep of whatever pedal you're plugging into. Because it's automated, you're not doing it with your foot, you're pressing the button. Being able to adjust the waveform of the two knobs allows you to have it be like a square wave up and a square wave down for really choppy expression. Or you can max it all the way the other direction and have it be this big, slow, sloping expression triangle, and kind of anywhere in the middle. Because you can set it anywhere, you can have it so it kind of like gently, slowly rises, then hard drops off. Or you could have it kind of quickly rise and quickly fall, or quickly rise and slightly more quickly fall. There's so many things you can do with it. Not only that, but you then have 4 different ways that it expresses. You have a triggered version where when you press down on the foot switch, it starts to rise, and when you let go of it, it drops back down at those predetermined rates. Or you have latching, where you press the button and it rises to the toe, you press it again and it falls back down. Beyond that, you have an auto mode where it's always going based on your predetermined rise and fall rates and shapes. And finally, you have a tap tempo version of it where it will rise and fall based on your tap tempo, factoring in the wave shape that you have put in, which is really cool and allows you to have some very interesting applications there. But it gets crazier than that, and that is because of 5 things. The fact that you have 4 outputs and MIDI control. We'll explore later in this video that you can control 4 devices. We only ever explore, I think, 3 in this video, but you could explore expression control on 3 or 4 different devices, all moving in tandem with one another, which can be really cool. But MIDI control allows you to set your start, your stop, your rise, and your fall separately for each of those ports. You can set any combination that you want. You can have this thing set up so that like the A port gives the like world's slowest rise and then a hard drop over the course of like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, while the B port has a sharp square wave that repeats every 2 seconds. You can do nearly anything expression-wise with this thing, with the MIDI integrations. And this is part of why I'm refilming this portion of the video. We talked about this a little bit. We didn't quite emphasize how impressive that is because I hadn't yet really dug into it. But the thing that I will say is, this is where this pedal really, really kind of introduces a learning curve. This video really took some like time and attention and digging into the MIDI on this pedal for me to really get a handle on it. I was talking to COOPERFX about it. I was swapping out different MIDI controllers, trying to find the best case scenario. Once I had it dialed, once I had it set up with my Morningstar controller and this guy, I was set. I was quickly setting up all of my MIDI parameters on the desktop editor, and they were coming out exactly how I wanted them to. But I will say that this, in its kind of fullest form, is not for the faint of heart. This thing is deeply impressive and also reasonably complicated. You kind of have to be able to visualize what you want your MIDI values to represent, or vice versa, to really kind of like fine-tune this stuff. But I will say that even if you only have a vague concept of how to dial MIDI in, just the experimentation of pulling up the MIDI values for the 4 different ports and just seeing where it takes you creates some really, really great stuff. The final jam that we kind of go out on tonight really highlights that. I kind of felt like I only had a 70% conception of how I was ramping the 3 pedals that we end up ramping at the end of this video. And I was thrilled with the turnout. I thought that it created something so interesting and engaging and different, where I could have just left it alone and it would have created its own never perfectly repeating music for eternity. And I think that that represents something really special with this pedal. And I was ramping stuff in this too at the time. So these guys together are a powerhouse of unpredictable, experimental, but also MIDI clockable music ingenuity. So Tom and the Cooper team, you guys are excellent. Thank you for sending these out. Thank you for asking me to do this video. This was one of the hardest videos I've had to work on in a while, and I've loved almost all of it. If you like to kind of like do some pre-prep to really know that you're gonna have some solid payoff, these are worth your time. I recommend it. Let's go to the sound samples. So I think that the most useful way to explore this portion of the video is going to be by recreating some of the pedal pairings in the signal path selector that we used on the intro. We are not going to use all the same parts musically that we played on the intro, but we are going to use a lot of those same combinations and kind of implement them in similar or the same ways that we did while writing that intro piece. So for example, we'll start off with some really basic stuff like a delay and a reverb in parallel with one another, and then we will kind of ramp up to more kind of interesting and off the wall possible solutions from there on out. Before we start diving into some sound samples though, let's talk through our context. I am playing a 1972 Fender Mustang into the Empress Compressor Mark II, the Chase Bliss Audio Benson Preamp Mark II. From there we go to the COOPERFX Signal Path Selector, down to the Strymon Dig in stereo, up to the New Neighbor Immerse in stereo, and the Strymon Iridium in stereo, both of which you can kind of see poking out from underneath our Goodwood Audio lift riser. For the first portion of this, we are not going to be using the New Neighbor Immerse or the Strymon Dig. I will let you know when we bring those in as we kind of change up what's happening in the signal path selector. But while we're using wet effects in the signal path selector, we're going to try to avoid using stereo wet effects afterwards because it might obscure kind of what we're shooting for here. Here's our dry signal, just the guitar, the compressor, the drive, and the amp. And let's start by showcasing kind of what's so interesting about something like parallel effect processing. We're going to turn on just the red channel on the signal path selector and bring in that, that tonal recall. And then we'll actually kind of dial the mix back on the tonal recall and remove our dry through to kind of hear just right off the bat at the most basic level why parallel signal processing can be useful. Difference between the last three settings that we set up. At a very basic level, one of the things that I find really helpful about parallel signal processing, part of why I like wet, dry, wet rigs so much, is I find that isolating that dry signal separate from your wet stuff can can really provide an added level of not only clarity for your dry signal, but also will actually do a really great job of allowing you to switch between wet effects, especially delays that can kind of sit differently in the mix from one another, that have mix knobs that actually taper your dry signal in very different ways, and creating a sense of uniformity and consistency, knowing that you can keep that dry guitar tone cranked all the way up or start to roll it back without having to necessarily increase your delay amount can be really useful for balancing different pieces of your mix. Obviously, this is a very, very rudimentary and entry level application here. So let's bring in our dark world on the other channel in parallel with one another and kind of hear kind of why you might want more effects than one in parallel with one another. So that's a lot of wet effects that kind of starts to overshadow your dry guitar. But let's dial the reverb back a little bit, more significantly than the delay, but we'll dial the delay back as well. And you can kind of hear where the value in this parallel mixing thing comes in as far as balancing the clean repeats of your delay alongside that smooth decay of your reverb, as opposed to having the delay line consistently like punch the reverb up. Okay, so we're going to crank the repeats, the kind of the regen on the tonal recall so that it kind of runs away for forever, but also turn the reverb way high up on the mixer, on the signal path selector, but also turning the dwell down. So we'll get a much more in-your-face reverb sound, but with a much longer decay on the delay. And I want to play with and kind of give a demonstration of why you might want those two things in parallel and not interacting with each other. It's so useful to be able to have those things operate alongside one another. Being able to have that kind of huge, shimmery, like body of that reverb as you hit your dry notes. But having your delay line totally clear and like clean and like being able to hear those repeats with some added clarity. Whereas let's go ahead and we'll dial the dark world mix back so you can hear the repeats, but we are going to now run the tonal recall into the dark world to see how you kind of lose some of the subtlety of what we're going for with this setup. So you can hear we've had to sacrifice some of that really high mix on the dry guitar And we're also losing clarity on the degradation of those repeats. And let's jump back to that original layout. Oh, this is kind of cool too. Because the Dark World has the ability to run two different effects in parallel, we are actually kind of running 4 lines alongside one another. We are running a low decay, very, very big, bright, wet plate next to an octave down modulated reverb, next to a delay line, and next to our dry guitar signal. And of course, we also have the ability to very flexibly and quickly change the routing the other way around. So we could take this and put that bright, splashy reverb that you're hearing right there, and we could actually feed that into that infinite decaying delay line. Let's close out this section by doing what must be a staple of this channel at this point, which is taking everything we just talked about, adding a stereo reverb behind it to give it a little bit of that added width, and just to see how cool the processing of parallel delay and reverb next to one another into a nice wide stereo reverb can actually be. For this next section, I want to ramp up the complication a small amount, as well as introduce a little bit more nuance to what we're doing here. We've swapped out the Chase Plus Audio tonal recall for the Chase Plus Audio Therme, and we've swapped out the Chase Plus Audio Dark World for the Chase Plus Audio Gravitas Tremolo. We're running that at 18 volts for higher headroom, and we have hooked it up to the COOPERFX expression generator, which is ramping the rate of the trem. The interesting thing about this is because the tremolo is kind of like a dry tone modulator, it's not like a wet effect or a delay effect, we have taken out the dry tone completely in this setup, and we're just going to be using the Gravitas for our dry tone and Therme in parallel for some of that kind of sparkly, pitch shifty weirdness and clock noise, but in a version of it that doesn't get chopped up by the tremolo or vice versa. So we'll start off by ramping the tremolo so you can hear that, and then we will bring in the Therme. I think it's also worth noting that we are running through the New Neighbor Immerse. So you can hear bringing in some stereo delay just to kind of, it's context. We like to build out these kind of big, lush, interesting soundscapes, and I think that parallel gravitas and Therme as kind of your base level going into the rest of it can be really interesting. That's really cool. Okay, in the same context, we are now going to take Therme's delay time up to the absolute minimum delay time and essentially convert it into a low-passed, like lo-fi real-time modulator. And then we will bring that in alongside the tremolo. We might start ramping the low-pass filter on it at a different rate than the gravitas to see how kind of two different tremolo-y dry tone modulators interact at different rates in a parallel mixer like this. So we've set up the Therme as kind of a like ramped low-passed lo-fi guitar modulator, which sounds like this. So let's put that back next to the gravitas and see how the two of those kind of interact. Okay, this wasn't a combination that we used in the intro piece, but this is a combination that I find to be really, really interesting that I stumbled on a couple days after I wrote that first piece for this video. This is the gravitas set with a kind of ramping square wave on one side using the expression generator, and the Chase Plus Audio blooper on the other side set with the kill dry turned on, so it's just your looped signal coming back through in reverse, with the repeats turned way down so that it functions less as a looper and more of just kind of like a constantly listening reverse delay sampler almost. So here's our dry tone, and then we'll bring in both sides of that, which I think is just a really cool and interesting non-traditional application of parallel effect mixing. So this is a combination that I found to be really, really engaging and interesting during the intro video. This is the Maris Enzo on the left side the arcades on the right side, both are set as kind of like synth bass, sub-octavey, kind of like very gripping synth textures that I was using kind of for synth bass on the intro video. We'll listen to both, and then we'll see kind of how you can blend the two as two completely separate standalone synth basses running down that center channel to create kind of entirely new textures that you wouldn't be able to get out of either individual synth pedal. So let's start by soloing up the arcades, and then we'll solo up the Enzo, and then we'll stack the two, play with kind of the filtering on both of them and the levels on both of them to see if we can't get somewhere really menacing. So, but again, dry tone on my little like low output Mustang. Okay, this part of the video is kind of a section out of time. We're actually recording this after we recorded the final following section of the video, which we'll close things out on. I kind of dove straight into the expression generator in a pretty aggressive way for the next section of the video. And I wanted to kind of like take a step back and run through some of the simpler features and kind of build up to what we're about to do, because I found that the expression generator is maybe the most simple to the most complicated thing on this board right now. So we're going to start things off pretty simple, ramping two devices that I think you can really clearly tell what's being done when you ramp them, which I find to be very, very useful. So we are going to be ramping the Gravitas and the Mood by Chase Plus Audio in parallel in the signal path selector. So before we jump into that, here is our dry tone. Then let's give the Gravitas a listen in kind of our heel down position. Very fast, very stuttery. But you can kind of set your heel and toe positions anywhere you want them to be by adjusting your start and stop times on your expression generator. So now we're in a very slow speed. Or anywhere in the middle. And likewise, we'll kill that and we'll pull up the Mood, which is set to just a washy reverb right now. So you can kind of hear what we're doing. It's pretty standard expression stuff, but the expression generator allows you to set your start and stop points, the wave shape by which they get from one to the other, and you can pick one of 4 different ways to get there. You can have it be triggered where when you press down, it ramps as long as you're holding it. You can have it so that you press it once and it just moves to the other position. You can have it so it just kind of like auto sweeps back and forth, or you can have it so it locks into a tap tempo. So let's start things off by setting our start and stop waveforms. We are going to set it up so that it kind of slowly ramps up and slowly ramps back down right now by holding the button above the foot switch and turning the start and stop times to set the rise and fall waveforms. We'll set it to a nice kind of gentle slope on both directions, and then we'll kind of watch how it gently climbs as we hold it, and then it gently climbs back down as we release using the triggered mode, which only expresses while you're pressing down on the foot switch. So you can kind of see very slow, you can get really beautifully slow expression movements with this, which is really cool. So let's go ahead and shorten up that climb speed and basically quicken it, and then make the stop a much faster drop back off. And similarly, let's move over to the latching mode, where it just kind of, when you press the foot switch, it goes to the other mode, and when you press it again, it returns. again, we can actually slow both of those transitions way down, but rather than sitting through a really long transition, we can then also take up our start and stop time so they sit closer to one another in that spread. Okay, so we've moved over to the auto mode, which will automatically make the transition between those two spaces on your expression sweep at whatever the rate that you've set those rise and fall times at. So it's moving very slow because we have them set as slow as they can go. So we can speed that up by creating more of a square wave shape between the two. And likewise, you can actually set it so that it follows your tap tempo, which can be set on the pedal as we're about to demonstrate. Or using MIDI. And speaking of MIDI, this MIDI control is why this pedal gets so interesting. And it's not just being able to MIDI clock your expression ramping. It's about being able to unlock the kind of like inner chaos that is the expression generator by using that MIDI control in conjunction with MIDI CC messages from your MIDI controller to send different rise and fall rates, as well as different heel and toe positions for all four of your outputs. So let's go ahead and set some disparate rates and highs and lows for our mood and our gravitas, and kind of hear how that makes things a little bit more interesting than everything ramping in conjunction. Okay, so with everything that we have kind of covered so far, we're going to endeavor to put it all together into one piece of slowly moving generative music. As you can see, we have a very complicated set of cablings right now. What we're doing here is parallel mixing the mood and the blooper. We will give them separate pieces of music to work with. We will then use the MC8 to modulate automatically the volume of volume A and B on the signal path selector, allowing both of those to kind of fade in and out on their own side by side, while also automatically ramping the clock speed on the mood, the stability and the B modifier on the blooper, and the mix 2 on the dig, all at different rates, using MIDI commands from the MC8 to the COOPERFX expression generator. What this should result in is a very kind of nebulous piece of music that very slowly changes those different parameters at different speeds so that you're not getting the same chunk of music repeating over and over, despite the fact that a lot of these loops will become theoretically fairly stable. We'll still kind of play into it a little more as we go. Like I'll be feeding some new signal into the mood's full wet reverb as we go just for fun. And so you can kind of hear how that automatically moving clock interacts in interesting ways with that. So I'm going to switch the expression generator over to a not automated version right now so that you can kind of hear the bass level stuff that we're doing, and then we'll start moving things. So for context, here is our dry signal. So you've essentially created a tape loop in the blooper, a kind of predetermined length of blank loop that we can now fill in. So let's just swell some simple notes into the blooper for it to start playing with.